Hi guys, in today's video we're going to discuss prenuptial agreements. So let's get some nomenclature out of the way. A prenuptial agreement is an agreement that is entered into by two people who intend to marry each other, of course, and which sets forth the rights of each person in the property of the other in the event of divorce or death. Prenuptial agreements are regulated by state law. Many states have adopted the Uniform Premarital Agreement Act, which sets forth some common rules regulating the prenuptial agreement. Let's move on now to enforcement by courts. The number one thing that you need to keep in mind is that consideration is not required, because the marriage itself is considered sufficient consideration. The prenuptial agreement, of course, is effective upon marriage, but if the marriage is void, which technically means that there was no marriage in the first place, the prenuptial agreement is enforceable nonetheless to the extent to prevent injustice. According to the UPAA, which, as I said before, is the Uniform Premarital Agreement Act, and according to the majority of the states, courts, in considering whether to enforce a premarital agreement, consider the following factors. Number one, whether the agreement was executed voluntarily. And here, of course, they look to whether there was fraud, duress, or coercion. The absence of a legal counsel is considered together with other factors. Another situation that courts consider with particular attention is whether the prenuptial agreement was presented very close to the wedding date. In this case, they will consider the totality of the circumstances, and in particular, whether there was a reason to proceed to the marriage nonetheless, such as a pre-existing pregnancy, embarrassment arising from the cancellation of the wedding, financial losses arising from the cancellation of the wedding, the absence of legal counsel, and all the circumstances that surrounded the quote-unquote unfair surprise. Another factor that is considered by courts is whether the agreement was unconscionable. In this situation, courts have the power to refuse to enforce a provision or an entire contract to avoid provisions that are so one-sided as to be unconscionable. Finally, the last factor that is considered by courts is whether there was proper disclosure by the parties of property and financial situation before the execution of the prenuptial agreement. Finally, we need to consider a few specific provisions that courts have refused to enforce. The first of such provisions is a provision regarding the child support or the child custody. Here, courts have taken the position to consider such provisions viable to best serve the best interest of the child. Another provision that courts have refused to enforce is the waiver of alimony, in the situation where such a waiver causes the spouse to become a public charge. Alright, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and watch my other videos on US law. Bye everyone.